If you've ever felt invisible, like no one would care if you disappeared, then stay with me, because this story will reach into your chest and pull out every emotion you've tried to bury. Before we begin, hit that like button, subscribe to Alpha Reversed, and drop a comment telling me what you would do if you found someone starving and alone. Now, let's dive into a moment that will change everything. The scent hit Cale before he even rounded the corner of the storage shed. A mixture of desperation and fear so potent it made his wolf surge forward beneath his skin, clawing at his consciousness with an urgency he hadn't felt in years. As alpha of the Silvercrest pack, he'd trained himself to compartmentalize, to separate his animal instincts from his responsibilities as leader. But something about this particular scent bypassed every wall he'd built, every defense mechanism he'd perfected over 2 decades of ruling with calculated precision and unwavering strength. His second-in-command, Marcus, had reported unusual activity near the waste bins behind the pack house, movements too deliberate to be wildlife, too cautious to be any of his pack members who had every right to walk freely through their territory. And Cale had come to investigate personally because lately the weight of leadership had grown heavier, the isolation more suffocating. And sometimes he needed to handle things with his own hands just to feel something real again. What he found made his heart stop in a way that no battle, no territorial dispute, no political maneuvering ever had, because crouched behind a stack of rotting crates, barely visible in the dim moonlight filtering through the trees, was a girl who couldn't have been more than 19, her frame so thin that her bones pressed against her skin like a skeleton wrapped in tissue paper, her clothes hanging off her body in tatters that might have once been a dress, but now served as little more than rags that failed to protect her from the autumn cold that had settled over the mountains. She was eating, if you could call it that, her trembling hands bringing scraps of food to her mouth with a desperation that spoke of days, maybe weeks without a proper meal, her eyes darting around like a hunted animal even as she chewed, too starving to stop, too terrified to feel safe. Cale's breath caught in his throat because he recognized what she was eating. The remnants of yesterday's dinner that the Omega kitchen staff had thrown out, food that wasn't even fit for the lowest-ranking pack member. And yet here she was, treating it like a feast, her hollow cheeks working mechanically as tears streamed down her face, silent and steady, as if crying had become as natural as breathing. He should have announced himself immediately, should have called for the guards, should have followed protocol for dealing with rogues or trespassers on pack land. But something kept him frozen in place, watching her with an intensity that made his chest ache in ways he didn't understand, couldn't explain, wouldn't acknowledge even to himself, because alphas didn't feel this kind of raw, unfiltered compassion, this visceral need to protect someone they'd never met. Her scent was wrong. That's what stopped him, because beneath the fear and the hunger and the unwashed desperation, there was something else. Something that made his wolf howl inside his mind with a recognition that transcended logic, a call that echoed through his very DNA as if every cell in his body suddenly remembered something his conscious mind had never known. She was Omega, that much was clear from the subtle sweetness that underlay her scent even through the grime and terror. But there was more, a depth and complexity that spoke of bloodlines he'd only read about in the ancient texts his father had made him study, lineages that were supposed to be extinct, powers that were relegated to legend and myth, and bedtime stories told to pups to make them behave. The moment she sensed him, everything changed, the air between them crackling with a tension that had nothing to do with threat and everything to do with destiny, though Cale would have denied it with every fiber of his being if anyone had dared to suggest it. She froze, her hand halfway to her mouth, a piece of bread crust pinched between her dirt-stained fingers, her eyes going wide with the kind of terror that comes from knowing you're about to be punished for the crime of trying to survive, for the audacity of not dying quietly in whatever ditch fate had thrown you into. Those eyes, even in the darkness, even filled with fear, were the most extraordinary thing he'd ever seen, a shade of amber that seemed to glow with their own internal light, flecked with gold and green in a way that reminded him of autumn forests at sunset, and for a moment, just a moment. Cale forgot how to breathe, forgot his own name, forgot everything except the way those eyes looked at him like he was both salvation and damnation, wrapped in the same impossible package. She bolted, of course, because that's what prey does when cornered by a predator, even though every instinct in Kyle's body screamed at him not to chase, not to frighten her more than she already was. But his wolf had other ideas, had already taken partial control before his human mind could catch up. And suddenly he was moving, faster than he should have without a full shift, his body flowing through the darkness with the practiced ease of someone who'd been born to hunt, born to dominate, born to claim what was his, even though she wasn't his, could never be his, shouldn't be his. He caught her within seconds, his hand closing around her wrist with a gentleness that surprised them both, carefully calibrated strength that could have crushed bone, but instead held her as if she were made of spun glass and moonlight. And the moment their skin made contact, the world exploded into sensation that had nothing to do with the physical and everything to do with the metaphysical, the spiritual, the absolutely impossible reality that was slamming into both of them with the force of a tidal wave. She gasped, her free hand flying to her chest as if she could physically hold back whatever was happening between them, and Cale felt it too. The snap of recognition that legends called the mate bond, the connection that supposedly happened once in a lifetime. If you were lucky, if the moon goddess favored you, if destiny decided you deserved something more than duty and obligation and the endless grinding weight of responsibility. No, his mind screamed, even as his wolf sang in triumph, because this couldn't be happening, not now, not with her, not with a starving Omega who'd been eating garbage behind his pack house, someone so far below his station that acknowledging the bond would be political suicide, social destruction, the end of everything he'd built over 2 decades of careful leadership and strategic alliances. But the bond didn't care about politics or status or any of the carefully constructed hierarchies that governed pack life. It only cared about the soul-deep recognition that said this person, this broken, terrified, starving person, was meant to be his in ways that transcended every law and custom and expectation. She wrenched away from him, stumbling backward until her spine hit the wall of the storage shed, her chest heaving with panicked breaths that came too fast, too shallow, teetering on the edge of hyperventilation, and Cale forced himself to stay absolutely still, to make himself as non-threatening as possible, even though his wolf was demanding that he close the distance, that he wrap her in his arms and never let go, that he take her somewhere safe and spend the next century making sure nothing and no one ever hurt her again. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper, rough from disuse and dehydration, shaped by an accent he couldn't quite place that spoke of territories far from his own, distant packs, or maybe no pack at all, the truly lost ones who wandered between territories like ghosts, unwanted and unseen. The words she spoke shattered what was left of his composure. Simple and devastating in their brutal honesty, delivered with the kind of resignation that comes from a lifetime of rejection and disappointment, and learning that hope is more dangerous than despair, because at least despair doesn't pretend things might get better. She told him to just kill her and get it over with, that she knew she was trespassing, that she understood the punishment for rogues on Packland, that she'd tried so hard to stay quiet, to take only what wouldn't be missed, to survive without bothering anyone, because she'd learned young that her existence was a bother, an inconvenience, something to be tolerated at best and eliminated at worst. She said it all in a rush, as if getting the words out faster might somehow make the inevitable end come quicker, might spare her the drawn-out humiliation of begging for mercy she knew wouldn't come. And Cale felt something crack inside his chest, something fundamental that he'd thought was unbreakable, the carefully maintained distance he kept between himself and the suffering of others, because an alpha couldn't afford to care too much, couldn't let emotion cloud judgment, couldn't put individual needs above pack welfare. He found himself moving without conscious thought, sinking down into a crouch that put him at her eye level, making himself smaller, less threatening, every line of his body language screaming reassurance, even though he had no idea what he was doing, no protocol for this situation, no training that covered what to do when you find your mate eating trash and begging for death. His voice, when he finally trusted himself to speak, came out rougher than intended, thick with emotions he refused to name, shaped by the effort it took to keep his wolf from simply taking over and claiming her right there in the dirt behind the storage shed. He told her his name, though she probably already knew it because everyone in 100 miles knew Cale Thorne, Alpha of Silvercrest, one of the most powerful pack leaders in the Northern Territories. But he said it anyway, because he needed her to hear it from him. Needed her to understand that he was speaking to her not as an alpha to a trespasser, but as something else, something neither of them was ready to acknowledge. He told her that no one was going to kill her, that she was safe, that she had nothing to fear from him or anyone under his protection, and even as the words left his mouth, he knew he was making promises that would cost him more than he could calculate, commitments that would turn his carefully ordered world into chaos. She didn't believe him. That much was obvious from the way her eyes narrowed with suspicion, the defensive curl of her shoulders, the slight tensing of her muscles, as if preparing to run again, even though they both knew he could catch her effortlessly, could run her down before she made it 10 feet, could have her pinned and helpless within seconds if that's what he wanted. But that wasn't what he wanted, and the realization of what he actually wanted terrified him more than any enemy he'd ever faced, any challenge he'd ever overcome. Because what he wanted was impossible, forbidden, absolutely out of the question given who he was and who she appeared to be. He wanted to gather her into his arms and carry her somewhere warm, somewhere safe, somewhere she could eat real food and sleep without fear, and slowly, carefully learn to trust again, to believe that the world wasn't entirely made of cruelty and rejection and endless grinding hunger that gnawed at your insides until you forgot what it felt like to be full. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the moment, Marcus's voice calling out for him, asking if everything was all right, if he needed backup, and Cale watched the girl's face transform from wary suspicion to pure terror in the space between heartbeats, her whole body going rigid with the kind of fear that comes from knowing that witnesses mean consequences, that the more people who see you, the less likely you are to simply disappear into the night as if you'd never existed. He made a decision in that split second, one that would change everything, that would set in motion events he couldn't predict or control, that would force him to choose between duty and desire, between pack law and personal truth. He called back to Marcus that everything was fine, just a small territorial dispute with a neighboring pack's scout, nothing to worry about, his voice taking on the commanding tone that discouraged questions, that reminded everyone within earshot that he was alpha and his word was law, even when that word was a lie, even when that law was about to be bent or broken or shattered entirely. When Marcus's footsteps retreated, Cale turned his attention back to the girl, really looking at her for the first time without the filter of shock or the distraction of the mate bond screaming in his head. And what he saw broke something inside him that he hadn't known could still break after everything he'd endured, everything he'd survived, everything he'd sacrificed in the name of being a strong, effective, unshakable leader. She was beautiful, even starving, even terrified, even covered in grime and wearing rags. There was something ethereal about her, something that transcended physical appearance and touched on something deeper, something that made him think of old stories about moon-blessed omegas, rare females born once in a generation who carried the goddess's favor, whose presence could strengthen a pack or destroy it depending on how they were treated. Her hair, matted and tangled as it was, showed hints of a color that might have been silver or platinum under different circumstances, catching the moonlight in ways that seemed impossible, almost luminescent, and her bone structure spoke of aristocratic breeding, high cheekbones and a delicate jaw that suggested she hadn't always been a starving vagrant hiding behind pack houses. He asked her name, voice soft, non-demanding, giving her the choice to answer or not, and the fact that she hesitated, that she had to think about it as if her own name was something she wasn't sure she had the right to speak, told him more about her history than any explanation could have. When she finally whispered it, Sarah, just Sarah, nothing more, no pack name, no family designation, no connection to the networks that defined wolf society, he felt his wolf settle and rage at the same time. Settle because now he had a name to attach to the face that would haunt his dreams. Rage because the absence of a pack name meant she'd been alone, truly alone, in ways that should have been impossible for someone so young. Omegas weren't meant to survive on their own. Their biology practically demanded pack structure, community support, the protection and provision that came from being part of something larger. And yet here she was, somehow still breathing, still fighting, still clinging to life, with a determination that spoke of inner strength, her fragile exterior completely belied. He stood slowly, telegraphing every movement, and extended his hand toward her in a gesture that was part invitation, part command, part plea, and waited to see if she would take it, if she would trust him enough to accept help from someone who represented everything she probably had reason to fear after whatever had brought her to this desperate point. She stared at his hand like it might be a trap, her eyes flicking between his face and his outstretched palm, weighing her options, calculating her chances, trying to determine if accepting help from an alpha was more or less dangerous than continuing to survive on scraps and prayer. The moment her hand touched his, small and cold and trembling against his palm, something shifted in the universe, some fundamental alignment that had been slightly off finally clicking into place, and Cale knew with absolute certainty that nothing in his life would ever be the same. That this moment, this decision to help a starving Omega he'd found eating garbage, would define everything that came after. He led her through the back paths of pack territory, avoiding the main house, avoiding the areas where pack members gathered and gossiped and would have questions he wasn't ready to answer. Questions about who she was and why their alpha was personally escorting a ragged stranger through their lands at midnight. His mind was already working through possibilities, calculating angles, trying to figure out how to handle this situation without causing the political nightmare that was currently looming on his horizon like a storm cloud. Because he couldn't just claim her as his mate, not without knowing her history, not without understanding what had brought her here, not without preparing his pack for the shock of their alpha bonding with someone who appeared to have no status, no connections, no value by the traditional measures wolf society used to determine worth. But he also couldn't let her go, couldn't send her back out into whatever hell she'd escaped from, couldn't ignore the mate bond that was currently rewriting his biology at a cellular level, making demands that transcended reason or logic or political convenience. He brought her to his private quarters, a decision that would have scandalized the pack if anyone knew, but his rooms were the only place he could guarantee complete privacy, the only space where he could keep her hidden while he figured out what to do, how to navigate this impossible situation that threatened everything he'd built. She looked around with wide eyes, taking in the luxury that probably seemed obscene compared to her recent circumstances, the plush furniture and warm lighting and evidence of wealth that pack leaders accumulated through centuries of careful stewardship and strategic alliances. He directed her to the bathroom, explained how everything worked with a patience that surprised him, because usually he had no tolerance for explaining obvious things, and laid out clean clothes, his clothes, which would swallow her small frame, but at least they were warm and whole and didn't have holes or stains or the general air of having been worn beyond their useful lifespan. While she showered, water running for far longer than necessary, as if she was trying to wash away more than physical dirt, Kyle stood in his kitchen and tried to remember how to breathe normally, how to think clearly, how to be anything other than a wolf obsessed with the Omega in his bathroom who smelled like mate and destiny, and everything he'd convinced himself he didn't need. He prepared food, actual food, not the scraps she'd been eating, but a proper meal with protein and vegetables and carbohydrates, enough to feed her without overwhelming a system that had probably adapted to starvation. Too much food too fast could make her sick, and he couldn't bear the thought of causing her more pain, even inadvertently, even in the attempt to help. His phone buzzed repeatedly, Marcus asking questions, council members demanding updates on various pack matters, but he ignored them all, focused entirely on the immediate problem of the girl in his shower who was probably going to walk out and still look at him like he might hurt her, like kindness was a trick, like safety was a lie. When she finally emerged, wrapped in his robe that dragged on the floor behind her, her hair clean and revealing that it was indeed silver, a color so rare among wolves that legends had been built around it, Kyle felt his heart stop for the second time that night because she was luminous, absolutely radiant, beauty that transcended conventional attractiveness and touched on something divine, something that made his wolf drop to its knees in reverence, even as his human side scrambled to maintain some semblance of composure. He gestured to the table where he'd laid out the food, watched her eyes go wide at the abundance, the variety, the clear care that had gone into preparation, and when she looked at him with confusion so pure it was almost childlike, he realized that she didn't understand why he was doing this, couldn't comprehend why a powerful alpha would waste resources on someone like her, someone who'd been taught that her existence was worthless, that her needs were burdensome, that asking for anything was presumptuous at best. She ate slowly at first, deliberately, as if she was still expecting him to snatch the food away, to reveal that this was all a joke, a cruel game designed to make the inevitable rejection even more painful. But as he sat across from her and made no move to stop her, no demand for explanation or payment or anything in return for his kindness, she gradually relaxed, her shoulders dropping from their defensive hunch, her breathing evening out into something approaching normal. He watched her eat with an intensity that should have been creepy, but somehow wasn't, his wolf completely mesmerized by the sight of their mate finally getting what she needed, finally being taken care of the way she should have been all along. And he made a silent promise to whoever was listening that he would find out who had failed her so completely, who had let an omega of her obvious breeding and power end up starving and alone. And he would make sure they understood the magnitude of their crime. When she'd eaten enough to take the edge off her hunger, when the plate was empty and she was looking at him with something approaching trust, mixed with exhaustion so profound it seemed to emanate from her bones, Cale finally spoke, voice gentle but firm, and asked her to tell him what had happened, how she'd ended up on his territory, what she was running from or running toward. The story that emerged was worse than anything he'd imagined, worse than the darkest scenarios his mind had conjured while she was showering, because it wasn't a tale of dramatic betrayal or sudden violence, but rather the slow, grinding cruelty of neglect, of being born to a pack that didn't value omegas, that saw them as property at best, burdens at worst, and treated them accordingly. She spoke in fragments, disjointed pieces that he had to assemble like a puzzle, telling him about the pack she'd been born into, a traditional group that still held to the old ways, the brutal hierarchies where omegas had no rights, no choices, no futures beyond servitude and breeding. And when she'd failed to present as a typical omega, when her power had manifested in ways that frightened them, they'd done what such packs often did with things they didn't understand. They'd cast her out, branded her rogue, and told her that if she ever returned, they would kill her without hesitation. She'd been 14 years old, Kyle realized with rising horror, 14 years old when they'd sent her away, and she'd spent the last 5 years wandering, surviving by her wits and determination, taking whatever work she could find, staying ahead of the enforcers who hunted rogues, never settling anywhere long enough to form connections or find safety, because there was no safety for someone like her. No place in wolf society for an omega with no pack, no family, no one willing to vouch for her existence. The fact that she'd survived at all spoke to a strength that most wolves twice her age didn't possess, a will to live that had kept her going through circumstances that should have killed her dozens of times over. And Cale felt something fierce and possessive rising in his chest, a determination that bordered on obsession, because she was his now, whether she knew it or not, whether she accepted it or not, and he would burn the world down before he let anyone hurt her again. He told her she could stay, the words coming out before he'd fully thought through the implications, the complications, the absolute political nightmare this was going to cause when the pack found out their alpha had taken in a rogue Omega with no background check, no council approval, no regard for protocol or custom or any of the careful steps that were supposed to be followed in such situations. She looked at him like he'd spoken in a foreign language, her expression cycling through disbelief, hope, suspicion, and back to disbelief, as if the concept of someone offering help without strings attached was so foreign to her experience that she couldn't process it as real. He explained, or tried to explain, that she would be under his personal protection, that no one would question his decision because he was alpha and his word was law, within pack boundaries, that she would have time to rest, to recover, to figure out what she wanted to do next, without the immediate pressure of survival dictating every choice. What he didn't tell her, couldn't tell her because she wasn't ready to hear it, and he wasn't ready to admit it, was that there would be no figuring out what to do next, because the mate bond had already decided her future, had locked her into his life as permanently as if the moon goddess herself had forged the connection with unbreakable chains. He didn't tell her that even now he could feel her emotions bleeding through their bond, the exhaustion and fear and fragile hope that she was trying so hard to suppress. Didn't tell her that his wolf was currently pacing in his mind, demanding that he claim her, mark her, bind her to him so completely that no one could ever take her away. He especially didn't tell her that the sight of her in his clothes, sitting at his table, eating his food, was satisfying something primal in him that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the deep, instinctual need to provide for his mate, to see her safe and fed and protected by his strength. She fell asleep at the table, exhaustion finally overwhelming caution, her head dropping forward until it nearly hit the wood before Cale caught her, gathering her into his arms with a gentleness that would have shocked anyone who knew him only as the hard, pragmatic alpha who made difficult decisions without flinching. He carried her to his bed, laid her down on sheets that were probably softer than anything she'd touched in years, and covered her with blankets that would keep her warm through the night. And then he stood there watching her sleep with an expression that was equal parts awe and terror because he'd lived 38 years convinced he would never find his mate, that he was destined to lead alone, to eventually take a chosen partner for political reasons and learn to live with the hollow emptiness where a true bond should be. He'd made peace with that future, had convinced himself it was better that way, that a mate would be a distraction he couldn't afford, a weakness his enemies could exploit, a vulnerability he was better off without. And now here she was, destroying every carefully constructed rationalization with her mere existence. The next morning arrived too soon, sunlight streaming through windows he'd forgotten to cover, and Cale woke from his position in the chair beside the bed where he'd eventually dozed off after hours of watching Sarah sleep, making sure she was still breathing, still real, still there, and not some fever dream his lonely wolf had conjured as a cruel joke. She was already awake, sitting up in bed with wide eyes that took in her surroundings with the clarity that sleep had brought, processing the luxury that surrounded her, the safety that had allowed her to rest so deeply she'd actually slept through the night for probably the first time in years. When her eyes met his, Kyle saw the panic start to set in, the realization that she'd accepted help from a powerful alpha she didn't know, had allowed herself to be vulnerable in the most dangerous way possible. And he quickly moved to reassure her, voice still rough with sleep, reminding her that his offer of protection stood, that nothing had changed in the light of day, that she was safe here for as long as she needed. The pack house was already stirring by the time Kyle ventured out, leaving Sarah in his quarters with strict instructions to stay put until he returned, and he could feel the weight of curious eyes following him as he made his way to his office, could sense the questions hovering unspoken in the air because pack members knew something had shifted, could feel the disturbance in their alpha's energy even if they didn't understand the cause. Marcus was waiting in his office, arms crossed, expression hovering somewhere between concerned and suspicious, and Cale knew he couldn't avoid the conversation indefinitely, couldn't hide Sarah's presence forever, not in a pack house where privacy was more concept than reality and gossip spread faster than wildfire. He gave Marcus the abbreviated version, explained that he'd found a rogue Omega in distress and brought her into the pack house for her protection. Left out the part about the mate bond because that was information he wasn't ready to share, wasn't sure how to explain even to himself, much less to his second, who would immediately see the political implications, the social complications, the 1,000 ways this could blow up in their faces. Marcus's reaction was predictably measured, years of working together having taught him when to push and when to accept his alpha's decisions without question. But Cale could see the concern in his eyes, the calculation happening behind them as Marcus tried to figure out what game his alpha was playing, what angle he was working that required taking in a nobody Omega with no background, no connections, no apparent value to the pack. The meeting with the council that afternoon was worse. 12 pairs of eyes all turned toward him with varying degrees of skepticism and hostility, because the council was made up of the oldest, most traditional members of the pack, wolves who believed in hierarchy and order and following the rules that had governed their society for centuries, and Cale was asking them to accept an exception based on nothing more than his word and his authority. They wanted answers, demanded explanations, questioned his judgment in ways that would have been considered insubordinate from anyone else, but council members had certain privileges, certain rights to challenge even an alpha when pack welfare was at stake. He stonewalled them, used every political skill he'd developed over 2 decades of leadership to deflect and redirect and ultimately shut down the discussion without actually providing the information they wanted, because he couldn't tell them about the mate bond. Not yet. Not until he'd figured out how to present it in a way that wouldn't cause immediate rebellion from pack members who would see it as their alpha being compromised by a beautiful face and a sob story. He invoked his authority, reminded them that he'd never steered the pack wrong, that his decisions had brought them prosperity and security and growth, that they owed him the benefit of the doubt on this one issue, this one decision that he was making for reasons he couldn't yet explain. They accepted it because they had to, because challenging an alpha directly was dangerous even for council members, because ultimately Cale had earned their trust through years of competent leadership. But he could see the doubt in their eyes, could feel their concerns rippling through the pack bonds that connected them all, and he knew this was just the beginning of the problems Sarah's presence would cause. When he returned to his quarters, Kyle found Sarah awake and dressed in the clothes he'd left for her, standing by the window and looking out over pack lands with an expression that was difficult to read, something between longing and fear, as if she wanted to belong here, but couldn't quite believe it was possible. Couldn't let herself hope that this might be real, might be permanent, might be the sanctuary she'd been searching for since she was 14 years old. He approached slowly, announcing his presence before he got too close. Years of dealing with traumatized pack members having taught him the importance of avoiding sudden movements, unexpected touches, anything that might trigger panic in someone who'd learned to be constantly vigilant. He told her about the council meeting, tried to explain the politics she'd stumbled into, the complications her presence created, the questions people were asking that he didn't have good answers for, at least not answers he was ready to share. She surprised him by asking to leave, voice quiet but firm, explaining that she never meant to cause problems, that she understood she was a liability, that she could disappear back into the world and he could forget he'd ever found her, could go back to his normal life without the complication of a broken Omega disrupting his carefully ordered existence. The suggestion made Cale's wolf rage to the surface, made his eyes flash with the gold of his animal, made his voice come out rougher and more commanding than he intended when he told her absolutely not, told her she was staying, told her that leaving wasn't an option, even though he had no right to make that decision for her, even though keeping her here against her will would make him no better than the pack that had cast her out. He tried to soften it, tried to explain that he wanted her to stay, that the pack could benefit from having another Omega, that she deserved a chance to heal and recover in safety before making any decisions about her future. But they both knew he was dancing around the real issue, The bond that neither of them had acknowledged, the connection that was growing stronger with every passing hour, every shared glance, every moment they spent in each other's presence. The days that followed established a strange routine, Sarah gradually venturing out of Cale's quarters but never far, always returning to the safety of his space as if it was the only place she felt truly secure, and Cale finding excuses to check on her throughout the day, to bring her meals, to sit with her in companionable silence that said more than words ever could. The pack noticed, of course, gossip spreading like disease, whispers about their alpha's strange attachment to the rogue Omega, speculation about her origins, her purpose, her hold over a male who'd never shown particular interest in any female before. Some of it was benign curiosity, but some carried the sharp edge of jealousy, resentment from females who'd hoped to catch their alpha's eye, from pack members who didn't understand why Cale would waste time and resources on someone with no apparent value, from traditionalists who saw Sarah's presence as a violation of proper pack hierarchy. The worst of the gossip was led by Elena, the pack's lead Omega, and a female who'd made no secret of her ambition to become Luna, who'd spent years positioning herself as the obvious choice for Cale's eventual mate, who saw Sarah as a threat to plans she'd been cultivating for the better part of a decade. Elena was beautiful, well-connected, politically savvy, everything a pack Luna was supposed to be, and she'd been patient, playing the long game, waiting for Cale to acknowledge what everyone assumed was inevitable, that he would eventually choose her as his mate for practical reasons, even if there was no romantic connection. Sarah's arrival had upended those plans completely, had introduced an element Elena couldn't predict or control, and her response was to wage a subtle campaign of undermining, spreading doubts about Sarah's background, questioning her intentions, suggesting that she was using alpha pheromones to manipulate Cale, that she was a plant from a rival pack sent to create chaos, that she couldn't be trusted. Kyle heard the whispers, felt the growing tension in pack dynamics, saw the way Sarah withdrew further into herself with each passing day as she picked up on the hostility directed her way, the subtle snubs and outright rudeness from pack members who took their cues from Elena, who saw an opportunity to earn favor with the lead Omega by joining in her campaign against the interloper. He tried to intervene, made it clear that Sarah was under his personal protection, that any disrespect shown to her would be taken as disrespect to him, but he couldn't be everywhere at once, couldn't protect her from every cutting remark, every cold shoulder, every reminder that she didn't belong here, that she was only tolerated because their alpha had inexplicably taken an interest in her. He watched her shrink a little more each day, watched the tiny spark of hope he'd seen that first night dim under the weight of constant rejection, and he felt helpless in a way he hadn't felt since he was young, and his father was dying, and there was nothing Kyle could do to stop it, nothing his strength or power or authority could do to fix the unfixable. The situation came to a head 3 weeks after Sarah's arrival, during the pack's monthly gathering, a social event designed to strengthen bonds and resolve minor disputes, to let pack members interact in a casual setting outside the formal structure of daily pack life. Cale had debated whether to bring Sarah, knowing it would expose her to scrutiny she wasn't ready for, but he also couldn't keep her locked away forever, couldn't protect her from pack life, while simultaneously trying to integrate her into it, so he'd made the decision to attend together, to show the pack that she had his support, that she was under his protection, that anyone who had a problem with her presence could take it up with him directly. She'd been terrified. He could feel it through their bond even though she tried to hide it, could sense her fear and anxiety and the bone-deep certainty that this was going to end badly, that she was going to be humiliated in front of everyone, that Cale's protection would prove insufficient against the collective hostility of pack members who decided she was unworthy. She was right to be afraid, though it hurt him to admit it, because from the moment they entered the gathering space, he could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on them, could see the way conversations stopped mid-sentence, how eyes tracked their movement across the room with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility, and he positioned himself slightly in front of Sarah, a subtle but unmistakable gesture of protection that any wolf would recognize as alpha behavior toward someone important, someone valued, someone who mattered. Elena was holding court in the center of the room, surrounded by her usual admirers and sycophants, and when her eyes landed on Sarah, something cold and calculating flashed across her face. A predator recognizing prey, a rival sensing weakness, and Cale felt his wolf surge forward with warning, with the instinctual need to defend what was his, even though claiming her publicly would open a door he wasn't ready to walk through. The confrontation happened faster than Cale could prevent, Elena gliding across the room with practiced grace, her smile sharp enough to draw blood, her voice pitched perfectly to carry to nearby listeners while maintaining the veneer of friendly concern that made it difficult to call out her cruelty without seeming unreasonable. She welcomed Sarah to the pack with words that dripped poison disguised as honey, asked questions designed to highlight Sarah's lack of background, her absence of connections, the mysterious circumstances that had brought her here, and Cale watched Sarah shrink under the assault, watched her default to the defensive posture of someone who'd learned that fighting back only made things worse, that the safest response to attack was to make yourself smaller, quieter, less threatening, less there. Elena circled like a shark, emboldened by Sarah's silence, by the lack of resistance, by the opportunity to establish dominance in front of witnesses who would carry tales of this encounter throughout the pack. And when she suggested that perhaps Sarah was more comfortable eating scraps than sitting at table with proper pack members, the room went silent, every eye turning to gauge Cale's reaction because everyone knew that was a line crossed, an insult too blatant to ignore. Cale's power exploded outward before he could control it. Alpha dominance slamming into every wolf in the room with enough force to drive the weaker ones to their knees, to make even the strongest pack members bow their heads in instinctive submission, and his voice when he spoke was barely human, was more wolf than man, was the voice of an alpha who'd been pushed past the breaking point of his patience and was done pretending, done playing politics, done allowing anyone to disrespect what belonged to him. He told Elena that Sarah was his mate, said it out loud for everyone to hear, let the words hang in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate, and watched understanding dawn across dozens of faces simultaneously, watched shock and disbelief, and in some cases horror, ripple through the gathered pack members because their alpha had just claimed a nobody, a rogue omega with no status, someone who'd been eating garbage 3 weeks ago, and by doing so had elevated her above every ranked female in the pack, had made her their Luna, whether they liked it or not. Elena went pale, then red, her carefully maintained composure cracking to reveal the rage and humiliation underneath because she'd just publicly insulted the future Luna, had committed a transgression that could get her banished or worse, and she tried to backtrack, to apologize, to claim she hadn't known. But Cale cut her off with a gesture, told her that ignorance was no excuse, that she'd shown her true nature for everyone to see, and that she would answer for her disrespect in the formal challenge arena where her words could be backed up by strength or revealed as the cowardly attacks they truly were. The threat hung heavy because Elena wasn't a fighter, was more politician than warrior, and going up against the alpha's mate in a sanctioned challenge would be suicide. But refusing would be an admission of guilt, a public acknowledgement that her accusations had no merit, that she'd been motivated purely by jealousy and ambition rather than genuine concern for pack welfare. Sarah's hand found his, small fingers wrapping around his wrist with surprising strength. And when Cale looked down at her, he saw not fear, but determination in those amber eyes, saw something fierce and powerful rising to the surface, the strength she'd been suppressing, the power she'd learned to hide because it made people afraid, made them want to hurt her before she could hurt them. She stepped forward, out of his protective shadow, and addressed Elena directly with a voice that shouldn't have carried authority, but somehow did, shouldn't have commanded attention, but somehow pulled every eye in the room toward her, and she accepted the challenge, said she would face Elena in the arena, not to prove her worth to the pack, but to prove to herself that she was done running, done hiding, done making herself small to accommodate others' fear and hatred and need to feel superior. Kale started to protest because the thought of her fighting, of potentially getting hurt, made his wolf insane with protective rage. But she squeezed his wrist once, hard, and looked at him with an expression that begged him to trust her, to let her do this, to allow her the dignity of fighting her own battles, even though every instinct he possessed screamed at him to simply destroy Elena himself and end the threat. The challenge was set for 3 days hence, giving both participants time to prepare, and the pack house buzzed with speculation because no one had expected this, no one had seen it coming, and everyone had opinions about how it would play out, most of them heavily favoring Elena, who had rank and training and years of pack support, while Sarah was an unknown quantity, a rogue who'd been starving and broken just weeks ago, and probably didn't have the strength or skill to hold her own in a real fight. Kale spent those 3 days in a state of controlled panic, watching Sarah train in his private gym, seeing glimpses of the power she'd kept hidden, the speed and grace that spoke of excellent training from somewhere in her past, the fighting style that was unfamiliar but clearly effective, and he started to think that maybe, just maybe, she might actually stand a chance, might be able to prove to the pack that she deserved to be here, that she was worthy of being their Luna, regardless of her unconventional arrival. The night before the challenge, Sarah finally told him the whole truth. The pieces she'd held back because she'd been taught they made her dangerous, made her something to be feared and eliminated rather than valued and protected. And Kale listened with growing shock as she explained that her birth pack hadn't cast her out because she was weak, but because she was strong, because she'd manifested as something that hadn't been seen in generations, a silver omega, blessed by the moon goddess with powers that could strengthen or destroy, depending on how they were wielded. She told him about the visions that had started when she presented, glimpses of future events, warnings of dangers yet to come, and how her pack's leadership had seen those visions not as gifts, but as threats, as challenges to their authority, as proof that she was touched by forces they didn't understand and therefore couldn't control. They'd given her a choice: renounce her power and submit to being controlled, being constantly monitored and restricted to prevent her visions from undermining pack hierarchy, or leave and never return. And she'd chosen freedom over subjugation, had chosen to survive alone rather than live as a prisoner in her own pack. Kale processed this revelation with a mixture of awe and fury, awe at the strength it must have taken for a 14-year-old to walk away from everything she knew, to choose uncertainty and danger over the safety of submission, fury at the pack that had been so threatened by a young girl's power that they'd rather cast her out than learn to value what she could offer. He asked why she hadn't told him sooner, and her answer was heartbreakingly simple. She'd learned that revealing her power only led to rejection, that people either wanted to use her or feared her, that there was no middle ground where she could simply exist as herself, gifts and all, without being defined solely by what she could do for others or what threat she might pose to their control. He pulled her into his arms then, held her with a fierceness that had nothing to do with the mate bond and everything to do with recognizing someone who'd been punished for being extraordinary, someone who'd been taught to hide their light because it made others feel dim by comparison. And he promised her that he would never ask her to be less than she was, would never demand she suppress her power to make him feel secure, would spend the rest of his life making sure she knew she was valued for exactly who and what she was. The arena the next day was packed beyond capacity, wolves from neighboring packs having heard about the challenge and come to witness the spectacle, because challenges for Luna position were rare and always drew crowds, always generated the kind of drama that would be discussed for years afterward, regardless of outcome. Kale stood at the edge of the fighting circle, his presence alone enough to keep order, to prevent anyone from interfering, to ensure that whatever happened would be fair and witnessed and binding according to pack law that had governed such disputes for centuries. Elena entered first, dressed in fighting leathers that showed off her toned physique, playing to the crowd with confident waves and smiles that said she knew she was going to win, that this was merely a formality, a chance to publicly humiliate the upstart Omega who dared to think she could challenge her betters. Sarah entered quietly, without fanfare, wearing simple clothes that allowed movement. And if anyone noticed the way the afternoon sun caught her silver hair and made it glow like moonlight, if anyone saw the calm determination in her eyes that spoke of someone who'd already survived worse than anything Elena could dish out, they kept it to themselves. The fight began with traditional formality, both participants acknowledging the terms, the rules, the understanding that this would be settled through strength and skill rather than politics or manipulation. And then they were moving, Elena striking first with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd never really been challenged, who'd spent years at the top of pack hierarchy and expected everyone to acknowledge her superiority. Sarah dodged, flowed around the attack like water, her movements economical and precise, conserving energy while Elena burned through hers with flashy techniques designed more